Hey everybody, Matt here from the iWall with an update for you on Hurricane Lee. A little bit late tonight, sorry about that. It is Wednesday evening, and we are tracking Lee as it moves to the west of Bermuda here. It will continue off to the north and then to the northeast, and then bend back to the northwest a little bit as it gets closer to Massachusetts' latitude, Cape Cod's latitude, and then it will continue off to the northeast into either Maine or Nova Scotia or the Bay of Fundy in New Brunswick. That's what we're going to be watching as we go into Saturday. It gets up to about that latitude there. So the track forecast is starting to come to a little bit better of agreement, but let's talk a little bit more about that. So here is the track of Lee from the models from earlier today, the 12Z models. Anywhere you see the orange and the yellow, we've got pretty good agreement. But notice how it bends back to the west here. It's going to be Lee's going to be captured basically by a trough that's digging into the northeast. And what it will try and do is pull it back to the coast just a little bit. We see this a lot of times during the winter time with different storms, coastal storms. It kind of determines where the rain and the snow may fall. Similar sort of situation playing out with Lee here, where it gets kind of bent back to the west just a little bit, but then as that trough kind of continues across, Lee will kind of go with it back to the north and then the northeast as it gets up toward Maine or Nova Scotia or, like I said, New Brunswick, Bay of Fundy. So we'll see how close it gets to Cape Cod and Boston. I think the takeaway right now is that we don't expect Lee to have a direct hit on Cape Cod or Massachusetts, Nantucket, Boston, those areas. However, I guess the question at this point is, does the core of Lee get close enough to those areas to provide higher end tropical storm conditions, hurricane force wind gusts, things of that nature? That's what we're going to be watching and trying to hone in on. So if there's a little bit of uncertainty in the forecast, it kind of lies in that particular area, Cape Cod, Nantucket, Boston, those areas. How much wind and rain and rough surf do we see? What is the surge exactly in those areas? So those are the questions we're going to be trying to answer over the next couple of days. But let's talk about some of the other impacts from Lee as we go forward in time here. We'll first talk about storm surge. That is what I am most concerned about with this storm. Lee is a very large storm. Tropical storm force winds extend out 265 miles from Hurricane Lee's center. That is a huge storm. And big storms like that, no matter what they are, Category 1 hurricanes, tropical storms, they're always going to punch up. They're always going to be a little bit worse, significantly worse even, than what their category what you would expect from that category. So if you have a tropical storm of this size coming, or a Category 1 hurricane of this size coming, it's not just a tropical storm or just a Category 1 hurricane. It's a big deal. Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Ike, two very memorable storm surge storms. Sandy was barely a hurricane. Ike was a Category 2 when it made landfall. Both had storm surges that were extremely notable, extremely damaging. They all were very big storms. The only storms that Lee really compares to at this point are storms like Ike and like Sandy. Those are the only storms that had this kind of size. And so when you have that size, this thing is going to be bringing a lot of water to the north with it, especially to the east of the track. So now we're looking what should be west of the track. This is Massachusetts, Rhode Island, up through Maine. The storm surge forecast right now is only about 1 to 3 feet, maybe 2 to 4 feet in Cape Cod Bay, along Cape Cod, and just to the south shore there of just south of Boston. What we think is going to happen is as Lee passes off to the east, winds will be kind of out of the north east here on the western side of Lee. And so what that'll do is kind of funnel water into Cape Cod Bay, and that's why the surge is a little bit higher there than it is elsewhere. It's because of the geography there. So we'll be watching that. We'll also be watching Boston as well to see if we can get some higher tides perhaps here. So although the storm surge values are, relatively low in these areas, there could be some significant or substantial flooding that occurs because of Hurricane Lee as it passes by. And when you factor in maybe the proximity to land, the rainfall that'll be associated with it, that's another thing that we're going to be watching as well in those areas. Now, what you don't see here is what's happening in Canada. And that's going to be the real crux of Lee's storm surge. It's going to come roaring into the Bay of Fundy, into mainland, coastal mainland portions of Nova Scotia. You may get some storm surge flooding even up to Prince Edward Island as some of that water kind of sneaks around Nova Scotia and up that way. So we are talking about the potential for some significant flooding. Now, I know a lot of folks in Nova Scotia think back to Juan or Fiona. This is a different storm than those storms. Those storms generally hit the eastern part of Nova Scotia. This one is expected to come into the western part. So don't necessarily say that the impacts are going to be the same from those storms. In fact, The impacts on the western part of Nova Scotia from Lee could be worse than they were during Fiona and Juan, just because of where the storm's coming ashore and from the coastal flooding and the storm surge that we see in those areas. That's assuming Lee kind of goes in just to the west of Nova Scotia toward the Bay of Fundy and into New Brunswick. The Bay of Fundy as well, we're kind of doing what a meteorologist on Twitter, Jeff Biardelli, referred to as a science experiment here by taking a significant hurricane into the highest tidal basin in the world during a new moon when there's already some astronomically high tides. We're going to have to see how this plays out, but there could be substantial storm surge issues in the Bay of Fundy into coastal New Brunswick and coastal Nova Scotia that are along the bay there. So things that we're going to be watching very closely as we go through the next couple of days. I think this is the most significant aspect of the storm, is the water that will be coming from this because of the storm surge, simply because of Lee's size. I think one of the easier aspects of the forecast is really the wind. We expect to see tropical storm force winds possible pretty much anywhere in interior Maine. Some of the higher elevations, you can see the White Mountains standing out there in New Hampshire. Mount Washington observations will be interesting to watch during the storm for sure. Some of the higher terrain in portions of Maine may also see some considerable tropical storm force wind gusts as Lee tracks off to the northeast here and comes in either in down east Maine or just to the western part of Nova Scotia into the Bay of Fundy. We will likely see tropical storm force winds overspread a good chunk of New Brunswick, particularly the southern and eastern half there. I kind of highlighted this with the red line. Anywhere to the south and east of there will be likely to experience tropical storm force winds. And you can see that extends down to right near the coastal parts of Rhode Island, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Block Island. Those areas may all see some tropical storm force winds and maybe even some low-end hurricane force wind gusts as well. So power outages definitely going to be a distinct possibility for Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, portions of New Brunswick, portions of Maine, and maybe even coastal portions of Massachusetts and Rhode Island as well. Some more scattered power outages I think are possible in the interior for New Hampshire and for Maine, and maybe parts of eastern Massachusetts and northern Rhode Island down toward the Providence area that could see maybe a little bit more wind just kind of on the fringe there. So it'll be more of a scatter type power outage situation there, I think. But really, I think we're honing in on the key aspects of this being generally down east Maine from Acadia National Park up to about Eastport, Cody Head, and moving into the Bay of Fundy and over into Nova Scotia and southeastern New Brunswick and maybe Prince Edward Island as well. So a lot of wind and a lot of surge, certainly on the east side from this storm. Obviously, we also have to talk about rainfall. Rain, not a huge deal with this, but given what has happened this week, we've seen some notable flooding situations in parts of Massachusetts in particular over the last couple of days. We think that the heaviest rain will probably go to the east of a lot of those hard-hit areas in Massachusetts, but you're going to have to watch this closely because if any of this can kind of shift back to the west a little bit, we could have some more flash flooding issues or some river flooding issues in parts of eastern Mass. Certainly in southeastern Mass, could see about 2 to 4 inches of rain where you have the dark green here. Maine, certainly going to see some heavy rain, probably some flooding. I don't know if it'll be significant freshwater flooding, but certainly some flooding, 2 to 4 inches, maybe even 4 to 5 inches of rain in some of the higher elevations. You can see a little speck of yellow there indicating over 4 inches across parts of central Maine. And then obviously into New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, you're expecting at least 2 to 4 inches of rain. That's about 50 to 100 millimeters of rainfall that you can expect from Lee as it comes to the north, a little bit less than that in Prince Edward Island. But that's something we'll be watching, of course. But the good news, I guess, is that Lee accelerates as it moves off to the north, so it's not going to be raining for too long in any one place, but still we'll keep an eye on that. All right, I've said enough. Check the website, theiwall.com, for more information on the storm. Take care and be safe.